The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, the politics podcast that put a 25% tariff on unnecessary outrage. I'm Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith. Every week we try to separate the informational from the infuriational.
And we give you actions to take too, because there's nothing worse than feeling left out of the decision-making process that affects us.
So put away the green pen, unlock those caps, breathe out, and prepare to start another Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex, your politics yoga instructor.
And I'm Naomi, the one cheating a little at the back of the class and praying no one lets out an accidental fart.
Checking her phone. This week, with Netflix sparking a debate on toxic masculinity, another policy on small boat crossings, sentencing guidelines ditched after a two-tier row, and a legal case against VAT on private schools, the culture wars seem to be alive, well, and dominating the news. Are these important things to be resolved, or displacement activity from a politics that is out of big ideas?
And as every story and screaming headline makes us want to switch off, to say they're all the same, to think nobody can make a difference, how can we fight back? By being agents of democracy rather than passive observers of its destruction.
And to help us, the man who has just written a manual on how we can, to use a hackneyed phrase, take back control. The chief executive of the New Economics Foundation, an economist, an author, but most of all, an activist. Danny Sriskandarajah.
Perfect.
Welcome, Danny.
Welcome, Danny.
Thank you very much for having me.
Danny, we're going to talk about your incredible new book later in the show, but one of the things you write about is the power of the slogan, the reductive nature of condensing very complex issues and arguments into three little words, whether the Brexiteers take back control, or in Australia you had the if you don't know, vote no. I'm going to put you on the spot. If you had to condense your book and its call to arms into a snappy one-liner, what would it be?
Probably be something like get active.
Yeah.
Get involved. Just do it.
2 words
Okay,
even.
get active.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, because, democracy is too important for us to leave to politicians and professionals. Everyone has to get active, get involved.
Amazing. And we often say on the show that we want democracy to be something people do, not something done to them. And you can't just wait for a democratic moment once every 4 or 5 years. You really got to get stuck in and make it part of something that you do. So welcome to the show. There is a lot to talk about, and we're going to get into it. Quiet Riot. It's been a while since we visited culture war issues on this show, largely because there's been so many economic and war-related topics to chew over and over. But with the enormous success of the Netflix show Adolescence, we wanted to revisit those thorny subjects. Now, if you haven't yet watched Adolescence, you should, but don't switch off. Don't be worried about spoilers. It really isn't that kind of show. You'll already know the premise. Over 4 episodes, each shot in one continuous hour-long take, the story of a 13-year-old English schoolboy and his family is told, charting his arrest and conviction for the murder of a girl he fancied who simply did not feel the same way. And it is an education for everyone who knows little about the ways young people communicate with one another, the toxic manosphere infiltrating the algorithms of young social media consumers, and the growing violent misogyny pervading society. And while Adolescence focused on hate against women, that is just but one area where populists seek to drive division. Anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-vegan, anti-LGBT, anti-anyone who can be blamed bar you for the plight in which you find yourself, whether that's unrequited love, being unable to afford your bills, or being on an endless waiting list for an operation or place to live. Where previously we were exposed to these views when stuck next to a racist uncle at someone's wedding, or in the back of a London cab, or when we accidentally wandered into a pub popular with BNP supporters back in the noughties, it now just takes a matter of hours, if not minutes, for social media platforms to serve up far-right content directly into the palm of your hand. And once you've watched one, even out of morbid curiosity, you'll be sent push notifications for more almost instantly. And it's not just the platforms you've heard of, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook. It's lesser-known ones like Twitch, BitChute, Parler and Dab that parents may not even know to search for on a child's device. In the case of adolescents, much of the blame lay with WhatsApp. I'm white and British-born, but I'm a woman. You're both immigrant men. So I feel we are a good panel to delve into this, drawing on lived experience as well as what we've learned from our conversations and research into this growing problem. So, Danny and Alex, my first question, how glad are you that you grew up in an era without mobile phones, or at least without social media?
Oh, God. I'm not sure I am that glad. I love my phone. Because I get curious about stuff, and if I can't look it up
Immediately,
it makes me nuts. So I cannot even fathom life before I could look up, like, who directed X and what other film did they do and what the person that was in it did.
But I was bullied at school badly. And when I got home, I was safe.
It stopped.
And children now have no safety zone. Unless the phone is off and away and out, they don't escape it. It continues into their own bedroom, these sanctuary places that you were previously able to run
I can't
to.
imagine that. That must be hard, because I took a fair bit of bullying at school as well, because I was the smallest one in my class. Because I was born in January, there's this weird quirk to the Greek system that you go like a year early than everyone else. So I was, I started primary school 4.5 years old. I was the shortest, smallest, and I had the bitchiest tongue you can imagine from age 4.5. I took no prisoners. So if they were waiting for anyone after class,
it was you.
It was me.
I think it's exactly that point you were making earlier, Naomi, about the fact that the sort of time scales have just truncated. Like, I remember getting my first phone. It was an old dumb phone, and you could text message and
play Snake.
But, it would take a while before every bit of communication took ages. Now it's everything, everywhere, all at once. Yeah. There are no boundaries between home and school, between work and home, right? For those of us who are working. And, I took a 3-month sabbatical while I wrote this book, and it was the first time I realized in 15 years that I had turned off notifications on my phone, because I'd had a smartphone with emails and other apps on it that were pinging me constantly and increasingly constantly. And so it's only by sort of unplugging have I realized how deep I've gone into this sort of chaotic world.
In episode 3 of Adolescence, the psychologist asks Jamie, the accused, why he has Instagram, and he seems shocked that she would even ask. So how do we deal with the fact that most children have grown up considering apps as essential as having a phone or computer itself?
I think technology always evolves, and what we take for granted and what we consider to be essential is going to keep changing. What's fascinating and maybe troubling about our age of human history is how quickly that update is coming, right? So never before have things changed so as often as they are, but never again will change be this slow, right? And so everything feels like we're playing catch up. Regulators are trying to catch up on how to regulate all of this. Parents are trying to catch up with their children who are using 1 or 2 generations of technology or platforms from the ones that they were used to or we were used to. And so I do think that there is a sort of a pace of change dilemma that we're all having to grapple with.
Because I remember having a Casio VPAM calculator, and I never knew what VPAM stood for, so I called it a very powerful adding machine. And I remember older people saying, you don't know you're born, you'll never be good at anything if you're relying on that. Oh, when I was a lad, you know, we used to have to add up on our fingers or use an abacus or just do it all in our heads, and this is going to ruin you and spoil you. And so part of me is thinking, am I just now that old person thinking, oh, these children are, you know, they need to do without this stuff. They need that, you know, it's going to hold them back. And really, you know, I should be going back to that former child and me thinking, oh, what the fuck do they know? They're completely wrong. And he was wrong, right? I'm a chartered accountant. Thank God for the calculator. But, you know, I think that it's that pace of change that is so terrifying because you're always playing catch up. Any intervention you put in, any mitigation, the children box around it quickly, the technology does. And I you know, sort of unsure about how we regulate all of this. And Keir Starmer met with the writers of adolescence this week. And the outcome from that seems to be that they're going to now show it in schools. They want all children to be able to watch this. But when I watched it, I found that this is made to alert adults. So is that the right approach? Does that risk seeming a bit lazy? What would be better? I mean, for me, it felt like it should be mandatory CPD for teachers, not being shown to the children who already know all this stuff. They know what all the emojis mean.
I mean, it's interesting. I guess it's about trying to create a common language so that you can talk about this stuff between both groups. Because the one thing it does is it's isolating. That pace is isolating. Because you can't go to your parent or even your older sibling and say, how do I deal with X, Y, Z? They won't probably know what you're talking about.
They wouldn't even know what X is.
No.
They've moved on to Twitch and other platforms.
I mean, counterpoint, when I interviewed Richard Watson a couple of months ago, who is a sort of Oxford academic futurologist, for lack of a better term, but he was saying this isn't some extraordinarily fast-paced, changing environment. Like we've had periods, if you think of, let's say, you know, the first 2 decades of the last century, where you had like a massive war and a influenza pandemic that killed millions of people, and cars were suddenly becoming popular and planes were becoming popular, and suddenly there was cinema. And, you know, the pace of change at that point, they weren't just improving stuff. It was genuinely completely new things that people had never seen before. They did find the right coping mechanisms and the right ways to sift through this huge amount of information and innovation that was coming their way. So I guess that can give you a little bit of hope, maybe.
I think he's right, but maybe what's different about this current era is what's changed is the delivery mechanisms for those sort of things. So you're right, we've not invented a new form of cinema, but we have invented a way of consuming cinema anywhere on the planet pretty much and instantly. And we haven't invented newspapers or channels of media, broadcast communication. We've made the platform just sort of so much more instantaneous, accessible, chaotic. And so I think there is that. That's what feels profound about the moment that we're in. And that's why regulators are catching up, because it feels like they're catching up. But of course, the other thing that really worries me is that these very platforms are not only sort of run by advertising, but we've become the commodity. That's what's crazy about all of this is that we've let, what this young man thinks is essential is actually him being sold to his eyeballs being sold to advertisers, and an algorithm then shaping his own behaviors. And
those advertisers often being political actors placing paid content, but largely organic. And so I'm interested about the source that needs to be tackled. Yes, we need to educate children and parents and carers and teachers and have that common language Alex speaks about. But we need to tackle the root cause of the issue, the violent misogyny in this case, but we've mentioned that there are many others. Because the rise of far-right content often coincides with a broader distrust in mainstream institutions, from media to governments, even science. So how much of the phenomenon is fueled by social media itself and the tech companies, and how much is it a deeper societal shift that the platforms are merely reflecting? That's a big question. Sorry.
No, it is a big question. I mean, I guess that's the point with algorithms. They feed themselves. In a way, it doesn't matter what gets the small ball of snow rolling down the hill. The point is that once it starts rolling, it gathers in size and gathers in pace. And I think that's the difficulty. And no one could be a clearer indication of the danger of it than Elon Musk, as far as I'm concerned, who has created this platform, basically an algorithm designed to pull people over to his point of view, and has been so aggressive about doing it that he's ended up radicalizing himself.
Yeah.
It's really quite extraordinary.
Yep.
You can sort of see it. You can see it month by month and week by week,
Yep.
how he is becoming more extreme, because the only things that penetrate his bubble are the things that encourage and magnify his point of view. That's the paradigm to avoid, I guess. How do we interrupt that snowball rolling down the hill? So maybe the answer is electronic detoxes that are regular. Maybe that's the thing that switches you off for a couple of days.
Yep.
Maybe we get into the habit of saying, like, a couple of days a week, we switch this stuff off and see how it goes.
I mean, when we go back to like No Email Monday and things like that from the early noughties, I remember being rolled out and firms didn't work at all.
Sure, but all of that stuff kind of had a basis in something it was trying to achieve, maybe ham-fistedly. But the point is, you do need something like that. You do need some coping strategies, because otherwise, and again, we saw that during the pandemic. Like, I met up with people that I hadn't seen for a period of X months during the pandemic, and they were unrecognizable to me in their views and, the sharpness and strength of their views. And I feel quite certain that had they been socializing in the meantime and kind of sharing this stuff with people around them, they wouldn't have ended up in those weird, quite extreme cul-de-sacs that they ended up in. But if you're just sitting at a desk and consuming this stuff 24/7, there is nothing to interrupt that thing gathering size and pace.
Quiet riot.
When you think about super successful businesses that are selling through the roof, like Heinz or Mattel, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But there's a secret. The business behind the business, making selling simple for them and buying simple for their customers. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout as Heinz and Mattel. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/promo, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/promo to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/promo.
Quiet riot. The radicalization isn't just happening to boys. It is happening to men. It is happening to young women and others. And Danny, I want to ask you about another paradox with a lot of this being far-right content. So far-right movements often claim to be nationalist, anti-globalist, but their online presence is strikingly international. The content and the tactics get shared across borders, particularly across the Anglosphere. So how do we recognise the paradox of a globally networked far-right pushing for ever nationalist and protectionist ideology? And does this call for an equally transnational approach to countering online extremism?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're exactly right about the sort of paradox, which is that I think those progressives, people on the left, if you will, recognize that globalization as it's manifest over the last few decades has some pretty dark underpinnings, right? It has left people in many parts of the world more insecure. Inequality has risen. People feel ironically less connected with each other, even though, goods, services, ideas, data, culture, capital flow across borders at sort of eye-watering pace. And we do, therefore, I think, need a new internationalism. It's a sort of new progressive connection where workers across different countries see their shared interest in fighting back against the sort of excessive capital. And of course, it's not by coincidence that those structures don't exist as any much, because trade unions have been attacked in so many parts of the world that the sort of international solidarity networks that once existed have been dismantled. And so I do think you're right that we need to think about this as a global phenomenon. We need global responses that are, truly internationalist and inclusive. I get frustrated sometimes that so many of us are so busy fighting the sort of national fights that we have too little time to build those international links that are so necessary.
And I'm going to ask one last question before I think Alex has got a few. AI, without question, the policy solution most in vogue from left to right. I mean, well, certainly from centre to right at the moment. And so for all the money invested in AI and the constant chatter about how clever it is and how we must harness the transformative power of it, is it not baffling that we are not using it to identify the language via emoji or certain phrases that is being used by children or being consumed by children, used by children, and being peddled by those wishing to radicalize, often, in very unkind or extreme ways?
The phrase that comes to mind is willful negligence. There's so much about the world, the digital transformation that's sort of unfolding before us that I feel is willful negligence by policymakers, by political parties. We've let, for example, the social media companies not only sort of colonize these sort of and extract huge amounts of value from us so that the world's richest men have made billions from us. And
they are almost entirely American.
Yeah, they're also American, and they're colluding with political power before our eyes, as we see. And there's that willful negligence. And now we're letting sort of, the next generation of technology evolve. And I'm a techno-optimist. I think technology can and will help human life, but only if we regulate it for the public good. We put guardrails and safeguards in. And AI is another case in point where it seems that, policymakers are somehow sort of passive in the face of all of this. So we can't really do very much, and it's a race to the bottom, because if we don't let these people work.
If we don't give them tax breaks on digital products.
There's a sort of technophobia that runs as an undercurrent to all of this as well, which weirdly I saw over and over again when I worked for the Office of Fair Trading. So the active policy of sectors coming in to represent their interests would be to try and flummox you with technical stuff. To say, our market is nothing like X market because these are the really technical. And once you look behind it, I genuinely think that regulation in this area is not difficult. Because you just go back to first principles, and it's actually quite easy. It's just to do with people being phobic about computers and, there's technical stuff going on that we don't understand. But if you were trying to regulate for a new toaster, you wouldn't have legislation that you were changing every 2 months where a new toaster technology came out, right? You would go to first principle. You would say, don't make toasters that electrocute people. Don't make toasters that melt down after 2 months.
I mean, they famously do electrocute people.
Yeah, but do you know what I mean? The point is, you move from a point of view of what do consumers need to be protected from? And we leave it up to you and your technical expertise to make that happen.
Yeah.
And when it comes, for some reason, when it comes to anything online, people just become, their legs turn to jelly.
Yeah.
They think they have to somehow create some technological solution on behalf of the technology companies that is then incapable of being circumvened. And it's like, you're never going to do that. You just have to go to first principles and say, it's up to you to make sure that young eyeballs do not see this fucking content. go away and do it. I mean, it really isn't difficult.
I think mistake number one was not treating these platforms as publishers, right?
Yep.
So and not giving them the same obligations that anyone else who publishes material has. And mistake number two is exactly as you say, Alex, not sort of regulators not being proactive in outlining what the duty of care is to these providers of social and owners of social medias, right? So that we can say clearly it is negligent, if these things don't happen, and you're responsible for the damage you have. And it's too hard for those of us who have suffered to find recourse in the current system.
Almost impossible.
I want to widen the lens a tiny bit and ask, it seems to me there is a general atmosphere now that really has accelerated since Trump's election, that it's okay to attack basically minority rights again. And we are seeing companies distance themselves from diversity initiatives. Today, I just read that the city regulator is going to stop asking them to publish data of how many, women they employ in what positions, how many, ethnic minorities and all of that. And it's like, is there a reasonable reading that as progressives, we pushed too hard and that this backlash is the price for not bringing enough of society with us, basically? Because I do get that in their grievance, I get that sense running underneath it.
Well, I think many people who've worked on any sort of aspect of diversity or social justice feared that the backlash was inevitable, right? So certainly I know friends, family who work in racial justice knew that there was going to be a counter-reaction to Black Lives Matter and all that's happened, right? And so people were being prepared for it. But I do think you're right that perhaps we didn't, those of us who champion these causes, if you will, haven't been good enough at bringing large numbers of people, or large enough numbers of people with us. And so therefore it's been too easy for others to weaponize wokery against those. But sense will win out, right? I think history is on our side.
Social progress has always faced backlash throughout history. Yeah. Throughout history, full of moments where strides towards greater equality get met with resistance. And I think we're sort of, in a cycle of progress and retrenchment. And I don't think that in itself is new. But I do think it's important to question the premise of backlash itself. And that just because there is opposition doesn't mean the progress was too fast or was wrong to do or whatever. I think it simply means that those who benefited from the status quo, the old status quo, are fighting even harder to keep it. That's what it feels like to me.
I undoubtedly that's the case, but I think there is also a case to be made that not enough people benefited from the progress.
Yeah, indeed.
And it's actually that soft...
The shifts were happening to them, not with them or for them.
It's that soft demographic that those who have a stake in keeping the status quo are now targeting in a really... a case is being heard this week that contends VAT on private schools is discriminatory, based around one child with educational needs that could not be adequately accommodated in the state sector. And I see this again and again. There is a sort of shamelessness in using test cases with progressive features to spearhead regressive opposition that is just devastatingly effective. We see it on the inheritance tax with farms. And there seems to me a danger that every time a right-wing government comes in, it undoes a whole bunch of stuff. And then a center-left government comes in, and it sort of twiddles around the fringes a little bit, doesn't really take the position forward in any way. Then we get another 10 years of a conservative government.
It can't be undone really quickly.
Yeah. Then we get another, decade of conservative government taking us back another massive leap. And it's for the first time I question the wisdom of that truism that progress, the overall arc of progress mean
evolution, not revolution.
It doesn't feel true right now.
Well, so I worry less about things like judicial reviews, worry more about how your point about how is it that a tiny number of farmers in this country are being, who are wealthy, who aren't really farming in the traditional sense, are being defended by vast numbers of people, many of whom are poor and have much to gain from higher levels of inheritance tax. And that's there is a sort of weaponization there that I do worry about. That, even Trump in his second inauguration speech has the audacity to say that he's there because too many people have been extracting wealth and power from the American system, and standing behind him or sitting behind him were these billionaires who were,
the 20 richest people in the world.
Exactly, the very robber barons who've been extracting wealth at eye-watering rates. I think that, and he's sort of using this narrative that he's there to stand up for those who are weakest.
Yeah, I mean, look, we see it happen time and time again at the moment, and on the issue of that child with special educational needs, the tactic is so effective because it exploits legitimate concern to protect entrenched privilege. So back to the point I was making earlier about, those that benefited from the status quo go out even harder to defend it.
They're just really good at this.
They are just really good at it. And it forces progressives onto the defensive, makes us appear like we're harming vulnerable people, even when the broader goal is to create a fairer system. And Danny and I were actually at a meeting yesterday where we did sort of talk about this. Like, far too often, the left and progressives accept the terms of debate and argue with the right and then lose because the terms of the debate are not actually right, and they're set by the right. And what we've got to do, and certainly the Labour government needs to do, is to actually, set the parameters first, rather than sort of be fighting on that right-wing narrative.
I mean, the two-tier justice thing, I just find it extraordinary that we've ended up in there is a two-tier justice system. There has been one for decades. It punishes poor people and people of color. It's like there is not a single statistic that doesn't bear that out. Yeah. And somehow we have ended up arriving at an almost consensus position that the real problem is that justice is too harsh on straight white guys. And it's like, how does that happen? How do we arrive at the exact opposite position from the truth?
Because we get dragged into the narratives instead of challenging them head on. It is the same point. It is about being forced to accept those terms of debate rather than saying I don't, and here's actually what's going on. Look, of course, you can blame moral panic and the culture wars, selective storytelling around all of this. You sort of take one high-profile case where somebody from a minority background received a relatively light sentence or whatever, and then that becomes the thing that gets pushed.
Again, it's the choosing of test cases.
Exactly. Punishment as populism, and this instinctive emotional appeal to the idea that justice is always equated with harsher sentences, and right-wing movements positioning themselves as a voice of law and order, and the left, is meanwhile engaging in debates about fairness and rehabilitation. It's too easy then to frame them as being soft on crime. But, I do think it comes back to the defensiveness and the failure, as you led with this whole section, Alex, the left doing tinkering at the seams rather than the major structural reforms. If we think, back to Thatcher and the major privatization agenda, if we think about Brexit, these things that the right have pushed through that are massive, constitutionally changing issues. And then the left come along and think, oh, well, better hold a coalition together.
Let's do veterinary agreements.
Or the Lib Dems and coalition, oh, well, we got a 5p tax on plastic bags. All we had to do was to agree to make it, tougher, to be tougher on benefit sanctions, tightening benefit sanctions. I mean, literally, they've admitted that was what the trade was. And you just think, why are you in politics?
Hi, this is Debbie, your Blinds.com design consultant.
Oh, wow. A real person.
Yep. I am here to help you with everything from selecting the perfect window treatments
Well, I've got a complicated project.
Oh, not a problem. I can even schedule a professional measure and install. We can also send you samples, fast and free.
I just might have to do more.
Oh, okay.
So the first room we're looking at is for guests.
Shop Blinds.com now and save up to 45% site-wide. Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Quiet riot.
How do we stop reform just capturing the agenda? Because at the moment I turn on the news and it's like every item would have been chosen by them. There's very little about actually health or education or even the economy. Like the whole roster of news items is boat arrivals and two-tier justice and crime and all of that. What do we do? How do we react?
So there's obviously no silver bullet, but I mean, there's at least one thing we need to do in terms of the sort of narrative point that you were making, Naomi, which is in the year or so I've been at the New Economics Foundation, one thing I've been sort of shocked by is how a sort of marginal fringe way of seeing the economy has come to dominate almost all aspects of public policy making and how policymakers in the mainstream behave, which is the sort of neoliberal idea that the state is bad and the market is good. Mm-hmm. And for 40 years, we've been fed this line. And so therefore, the state just needs to get out of the way, let, rich people get even richer. We shouldn't be involved in, the European Union because it's just a mega state that adding on to the current state. And those of us who care about the state as a manifestation of collective will, of ensuring social protection, of our sort of protecting our common humanity, almost need to sort of understand how sinister that sort of attack has been, and not defend the state as it is, but say, look, if we're going to progress as a society, we need to come up with these sort of adequate protections. Yeah. And so I think there is a sort of fundamental argument that we need to re-win, if you will, when it comes to the role
about the basic organizational principle, basically.
Yeah, that we, humans have survived and thrived when we've organized and created common institutions, to whether that's to innovate or to protect the least well off. We've created these institutions. We've come to create a relatively modern thing called the state as we know it today. It's really struggling. We're going to struggle to pay for it under the current terms. And we're going to have to come up with a better, more sustainable, more effective solution. And I think that leads me to the second point, which is I do think that there's space for some more radical solutions. And there's hard to get airtime for some of those. But why can't we think about universal basic income or living income, as my colleagues like to call it? Why couldn't we rewire the welfare system so that it creates a genuinely, compassionate, fair system?
Well, we're going to now move on to the calls to action for our listeners, because you're right, Alex, we were a little bit too doom and gloom in that section, and there are things that people can do. I'm going to suggest that we all sign up to back the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. They hold social media companies accountable and responsible for their business choices and highlight their failures, educate the public and advocate for change from platforms and governments to protect us all.
Yeah, and on a slight tangent, just because it is happening today, Thursday, as people listen, the Society of Authors has made Thursday a sort of day of protest against AI pilfering people's work with no recompense. And there is an event in central London, but if you can't get there, then we'll put the web address for the Society of Authors in the show notes, because they do loads of stuff that you can download and do online, because it really is a very important thing.
Quiet riot. Alex, it's now time for everyone's favourite segment, in which you dive into the cold waters of an ocean of media and emerge holding a bright pearl of the latest thing, designated woke. It is, of course, time for Wokey Dokey.
Wokey Dokey.
Now, a lot of you wanted me to do Republican Congressman Joe Wilson's tweet from the 25th of March calling Putin woke. I refuse, and I will briefly explain why. Wilson has been trying this for months. On February 18th, he tweeted that war criminal Putin's Russia resembles woke ideology, got a little bit of attention. At the beginning of March, he took it a step further, posting that war criminal Putin's worldview is woke in different costume, and got a bit more attention. On the 13th of March, he went further with woke war criminal Putin doesn't get to play the victim, which got him a lot of attention. So on the 25th, he went all out with his woke Putin post. So this segment will not reward such cynical attention-seeking behavior. It is here to identify the genuinely fresh, which brings me to Catholic neoconservative commentator George Weigel, a man who has been described as one of America's leading public intellectuals by himself on his own website. Who does that? George writes in religious magazine First Things that woke did immense damage to the American body politic, filling young minds with nonsense, falsified our entire national history, poisoned school curricula, and underwrote race baiting. So far, so Peterson. But then Weigel takes a sharp turn to the right. Unfortunately, he writes, just when the politics of grievance seems to be running out of gas in the American left, it has emerged with a vengeance in the American right. And he goes on to complain about distorting the record of NATO as a ripoff to provide cover for tariffs that would wreck the world's most successful engine of economic growth, as exemplifying a new grievance politics that's no different to wokery. American public life today, he concludes, would be considerably improved if those addicted to grievance politics, woke and MAGA, looked instead to the core Catholic social doctrines. So this week, MAGA is woke. And the frightening thing is, I don't entirely disagree with his thesis. I do think it is the right that have kind of adopted the kind of grievance politics that they always complain about.
Well, and look,
MAGA is quite woke.
And they are certainly
way.
snowflake. You can't criticise them without them getting very, very upset.
And very good at cancelling.
Indeed.
I mean, yeah,
he's got a point.
Yeah, look, I mean, of course he has a point. He's one of America's leading public intellectuals.
Well, thank you, Alex, and listeners. Listeners, remember, we love hearing about any instances of wokeydokey-ness that you find as you are perusing the internet. So do keep them coming to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Yeah, and Joe Wilson, give it a rest, mate. You ain't getting on wokeydokey.
Quiet Riot.
At the heart of addressing climate change, reversing democratic decline, tackling rising inequality, managing the digital transformation, and getting to grips with global problems lies one key challenge: delivering more power to the people. Those are the words of our guest today in his latest book, Power to the People, which is out on paperback in May, I think.
It is, yes.
We will include a link in the show notes for ordering the hardback that is available at the moment, and then we'll add the paperback when it's available. Danny, you're talking essentially about reimagining the democratic state, which is a pretty tall order. We will try to break it down, but can we start with a stock take? You describe civil society as a sort of tree with the roots, the bottom-up action basically feeding the rest. But you write that the early years of the 21st century have been a kind of winter for civil society. Why do you think that is?
I think there was a lot of hope at the start of the century that this would be, and I like to think of this as the century of the citizen. This is the century in which, our basic needs are met. We have democracy was pretty much taking root all over the world at the end of the Cold War and in many parts of the global south. And the internet was going to deliver us, unimaginably wonderful ways to organize and mobilize and express our sort of citizenship, if you will. And yet in almost all of those facets, it feels like we've been going backwards. Inequality is on the rise. Democracy is in greater peril than, since records began by almost every study that you look at. And civic freedoms, those fundamental freedoms that each of us should have to organize, to associate, to assemble, to express ourselves, are also under attack almost everywhere in the world.
Even in the UK?
Even in these so-called mature democracies where we think, Civicus, where I used to work, has a monitor of civic freedoms around the world. where it classes countries in 5 categories from open to closed. The UK has been downgraded twice in the last 10 years.
Well, of course. I mean, the policing bill, elections bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unsurprising, actually.
And so that's why I'm worried about what's happening. And as you say, that it key to so many of the challenges that we face, or key to the sustainability of the solutions, if we're to come up with them, has to also be about delivering meaningfully more power to people so they feel more ownership of those solutions, more in control of their lives.
But it feels like that is addressing an audience that will delegate things to people to do. So how do we break it down, I guess, into personal, achievable aims? How do I know what I might be good at and what my energy should go towards, as opposed to Naomi?
You should do you should go where your passion takes you and what you're interested in. I mean, the beauty of civil society, all of those wonderful things that we do together for common good, it lies in its diversity, right? The power is that people are doing things that they think are the right things to do, the important things to do. We may not always agree, and we often don't. But the beauty of that civil society is that we're meaningfully engaged in shaping our society. And the point you're making about the sort of democratic renewal is, in researching the book, I can't understand how it is we've led ourselves to believe that this is the be-all and end-all of how democracy can work, that representative democracy with elections every few years and a choice between often very similar-ish parties is the be-all and end-all of democratic life. And Alex, I know you're the expert in all things Greek, but Greek democracy or Athenian democracy looked very different, as did Roman democracy, as did democracy in other parts of the world. It was far more direct, participatory, deliberative. And yet
provided you were
a man and a landowner.
Yeah. So if you imagine, how can we augment the sort of the primary political institutions we have, the elected institutions, with more direct, more participatory, more deliberative mechanisms that have inclusion at the heart, or equality at the heart of them. So we have to sort of remake them for the 21st century. But, and that's where I get, people say, well, an argument that I make, I'm sure many have made in this podcast, is, why do we still have a House of Lords in this country? Why is it that the majority of our parliament...
You can come back.
Yeah. Why is it the majority of our parliamentarians, because there are now 800-odd peers, are unelected, and 7% of them are former party donors or officials? That's crazy. And yet we can't even, it seems, sort of have that conversation about what a fundamentally more democratic proposition might be. Why can't we have a public conversation or even a competition to decide what the next, more democratic institution might be?
I want to prod a little bit something you touched on, because that's the thing that I found difficult to get over. So it's easy to agree that, I don't know, monthly repair cafe where people take stuff to be repaired is a good thing, okay? But often civil society involves competing rights. And, there are people organizing around principles that might directly oppose my aims. Are we part of the same civil society? And is the fact that we're in a system that's basically binary a big problem with that? The planning application, the
zero sum.
Yeah. The consultation on a piece of legislation, the judicial review, the immigration appeal, it's basically a winner takes all. So there's no room for those competing rights to find a compromise. It's either I win or you win. How do we facilitate that?
For me, it goes back to the sort of theory behind civil society. Put simply, civil society provides 3 functions basically for humanity. One is what we each get out of the things we do when we volunteer or give to charity or take part in a protest, which, every single bit of research says that type of active citizenship improves your own lives, your own sense of fulfillment and purpose.
Mental health, physical health.
And the sad reality in many parts of the West in particular is that people are now having to work too hard, too long, or live in fragmented communities, and they don't have those sort of opportunities to get that sort of fulfillment from being an active citizen when you're not just trying to earn money or doing something out of obligation. Secondly, of course, is that the wonderful things that civil society does for society, because those repair cafes do get things repaired, or the charities do help marginalized people in communities. So the sort of associational life that's a fundamental part of society is hugely important. And then the third bit is civil society is part of the polity, that political debates and discussions don't just happen in elected chambers, they happen in everyday life. I think it's important that we have those other mechanisms to have dialogue and debate in society. And you might argue that one of the things, the price that we're paying is those mechanisms, particularly in real life as opposed to online, where people might have come together and, congregated, had a debate, disagreed and learnt to disagree with each other, have become fewer and further between, that we have fewer opportunities to do that, which amplifies the importance of the online space, which, as we've just discussed, can be deeply problematic, especially for disagreeing with people. And so, yes, it's a contested space. Yeah. We may, we almost certainly will find, disagreements, but I think that's an essential part of democracy. For me, sort of an active, vibrant civil society is the buttress of the democratic system, and it's in too many parts of the world, there's a clampdown by authoritarian states or even democratic states that are trying to shut down those democratic avenues, or co-opted.
Quiet riot. Quiet riot.
But some of it is cultural as well. Like whenever I go back to Greece, I am actively every time surprised anew at how much people talk about politics. They sit outside cafes and shout at each other about politics all the time. And here, if you go to a dinner party or something where you don't know everyone very well, you would hesitate to bring up politics as a topic for conversation. It would be, people would look at you a little bit askew, I think.
I mean, not at my dinner parties, but yes, you're dead right. There is a cultural hesitance. There is a sort of a Protestant, we don't talk about sex, religion or politics at the dinner table. Those are, off menu.
We don't talk about anything we might disagree on, basically.
Indeed. And we reinforce it with our institutions because, and I blame Blair for a lot of this because of the proliferation of state-funded faith schools during the Blair years, which do segregate children and has reinforced that othering. If children are able to learn and play and make friends alongside one another from different faiths, races and religions, it is much harder for a right-wing narrative to take hold with them once they're adults. Because they know a Jew, they know a Muslim, they played hide and seek with a Catholic. And so when they get adults telling them, bad things, why you shouldn't trust those people or why they're out to get you or they're in front of you in the queue for seeing your GP, you'll pause and go, no, that's my friend. My friend wouldn't do that to me. And that is a huge problem. We are beginning to embed that kind of, no, we don't even talk to people we don't share faith with, let alone might disagree with.
Where do you guys now meet people you disagree with in real life?
On Politics Live. I mean, everywhere. I mean, I do a lot of canvassing. I'm very much out there. I do try and get around the country as much as possible. At the moment, I'm doing a huge roadshow to every corner of the country to talk about the issue with Europe and to really understand. I watch a lot of focus groups, but that's my job. That is a privilege. I am incredibly privileged to be able to do all of that. And I've got friends from school and to a lesser extent university and family members with whom the political ideology is not shared in any way, shape or form whatsoever. And I have, in the last 3 or 4 years, made a much more conscious effort to engage with them and to understand. But it's exhausting, and you've got to have the resilience to be able to go, oh, okay, this is not going to go well. I need to, or it's going to raise my blood pressure.
I find because I work in this space, I have the advantage that people come to me, because they want a little bit of gossip and a little bit of the inside track and what do I think about X, Y, Z. So I have political conversations all the time, but it's certainly not, the norm.
Yeah.
Like, there was a time, I guess, 6-7 years ago, where I was back in the dating pool, I guess. And, I would go on first dates and I would be curious about the other person's politics because it's quite important to me. And people would look at you genuinely like you had done something outrageous by bringing up politics, like on a first date. And I don't get that. I don't understand it.
But I want to go back to the point Danny made about polity and the three pillars of civil society and the third one being the ability of it to then have an impact on the body politic. And to just remind listeners that if we don't do it, the other side are. And Danny and I were at a meeting yesterday and we heard about how Reform UK are campaigning across the country. They do not put immigration on a single leaflet anywhere. They are talking about potholes. They are talking about we're going to reopen the local library. We're going to get the bus service up and running more frequently. And they are running food banks. And they know that they are not licensed to do that. So the council comes along, often a Labour-led council, and says, no, you haven't got the right health and safety certification. You haven't got the food hygiene.
Colton don't do that in Greece,
we will close you down. Bingo, we've got something we can put on a leaflet. Labour trying to close down us feeding the poor.
That in Greece.
So if we aren't out there doing civic participation, we are surrendering it to people with a much more pernicious motivation.
It's what many people call organising, right? It's been at the heart of so many social justice movements, whether it was suffragettes to the trade union movements. You couldn't, it was very lazy and dangerous to assume that somehow a sophisticated sort of strapline and messaging
would do it.
Right?
Yeah.
You've got to build power from below. And we had to lesson we urgently need to learn that, and that means, as you say, investing in the things that matter to people, addressing the issues that matter to people and investing in sort of civic life, in regenerating. And I do worry, and I asked you the question about, where you meet people you disagree with, because one worry I do have is that those opportunities that we had, whether it was in a trade union or in a workplace or
football stands, which, the price of a ticket to see your team now is outside of the reach of many people. But previously it would be where you'd go and choose.
Yeah, but that comes back to the conversation we were having before. There are fewer physical spaces where we meet, period. You are ecumenical in your approach in the book, and I understand that. I get that. You don't want to discourage anyone from taking action. You don't want to create a sort of hierarchy of civil society. But do you get a sense sometimes that being given the option to sign a petition or join a hashtag acts as a proxy for real action, that it's like a self-soothing mechanism that, I signed the petition, so that takes off the edge to do things?
No, there's a phrase that's often used called clicktivism, which is the sort of, it's shallow activism just through a click or a like.
AstroTurf.
AstroTurf.
We're not really grassroots. Yeah. We're fake grass.
Yeah. So for me, I suppose it's sort of, if you think about a sort of participation pyramid or ladder, yes, for many people, maybe they're so busy or they're not really that interested that you'll only ever get them through that sort of click. But it's really important to invest in the whole of the pyramid and to make sure that there are other opportunities for meaningful engagement. And it feels urgent because, yes, we're talking a lot about the sort of urgency of the current political system and, how do we fight the rise of the far right or populism. But to me, the sort of long-term challenge is to rebuild sort of civic infrastructure, the undergrowth of civic life. And it need not only be in real life, it can be online. And it means coming back to dismantling those echo chambers and creating meaningful, hopefully, if not publicly owned, at least publicly protected spaces. The digital agoras of the future need to be publicly owned or better regulated. So I think that's the challenge that, online, offline, click or protest, they're all part of civic life. One call to action in this book is that we neglect all of these at our peril, because we then, democracy sort of falls apart from the foundations down, and we rarely focus on the foundations because we're so distracted by what's happening in the sort of theatre of democratic life.
And theatre is right at the moment, right? It's no coincidence that it is like the Kardashians, sort of.
But it's also it's worse than the Kardashians, right? Because only 1 in 7 of us even believe that these people our elected representatives are telling the truth, and so few of us actually even trust. So it's doubly dangerous. We trust
the Kardashians.
Yes,
more
exactly.
Than,
so it's theatre of people who are supposed to be in charge who we distrust and dislike.
Yeah.
And that's why I suppose that's my fundamental point, that bit of it is really important, but we should also pay attention to sort of protecting the sort of civic underpinnings, the civic foundations of democracy, and prepare them to be more resilient for the rest of the century.
The problem is that with an interconnectedness that you advocate comes the danger that if you can capture a part of that, a think tank, a charity, a social media platform, then that becomes a delivery mechanism for toxicity to the whole tree, right? With that has to come safeguards and regulation. Now, to return to the initial seasonal tree metaphor, you do say that you sense spring is in the air. So what is it that gives you hope? What are the green shoots that say to you there is a revival of civil society about to happen?
The scarier things get, the more people I see are sort of waking up to how dangerous the moment we are living through is, right? And I think that's important. The thing that inspires me, sort of the privilege of doing the jobs that I've been doing, Naomi, is that I've also got to meet some of the most amazing, brave activists who are standing up to autocrats, who are standing up for freedom of expression. Sadly, some of whom have paid the ultimate price, but there is this sort of strength and bravery. And one of the other things I found in my research is, almost all of the heroes we celebrate, whether it's Mandela or Gandhi or Rosa Parks or Eglantine Jebb, or all these people, they didn't set out to be democratic heroes, right? They were ordinary people who, found this extraordinary power and led to these amazing changes. And so history to me is replete with these moments where it feels genuinely dark, as if nothing can change for the better. And yet it does. And I think that is the hope that drives me, that things can change. Not that they will change. I'm not an optimist who thinks, of course, things will inevitably get better. I'm hopeful because I know that things can change. And I think it's really important that every single one of us plays our part, does as much as we can in driving that change, because it's not going to happen unless we do that.
On which cue?
You've got to buy the book, people. That is the main call to action.
Yeah, but
Danny, come on, you've probably got something else for them to do.
Well, get active. Come right back to where we started. I think that's really important. And maybe more selfishly, I think coming back to this point about radical solutions, where I currently work, the New Economics Foundation has been around for 40 years. It's been a sort of think tank that's always been about radical solutions, about how can we reimagine our economy so that it is fairer, that it is more sustainable. And so please look us up. I don't think many people know about NEF, but
we will leave a link in the show notes, and they probably do, because Miata, good friend of the show, and obviously she was your predecessor at NEF.
And now it's time to smooth the jagged edges of our news landscape with an encouraging story. It's time for Grin, and share it.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. I want good news.
Naomi, make me happy.
Well, I found a few that I really loved this week because they were stories about women being brilliant. From the little girl in Suffolk who wrote to Sainsbury's and started a petition at her school about the girls' uniform trousers they were selling not having any pockets, while the boys' ones did, and successfully got them to change it. And listeners will know,
brilliant.
Any woman in your life will be uplifted by a dress or a skirt that actually has bloody pockets in it. Well done, that girl. But right through to the women's football team, Thornaby FC, up in the northeast. They faced being axed last year because the board of Thornaby FC wanted to concentrate on the men's team. So the women got together, overthrew the board, got the women's team reinstated, and they just won the league.
Oh, amazing.
Good on them. But it was a good news story that will help millions of women, which is the one that I've chosen to focus on. And that's the news that the morning after pill is going to be made freely available later this year in pharmacies across England. So currently it costs upwards of £25, often £30. And I don't think I know any women who haven't taken it. And when you're a teenager, 30 quid will far outstrip your pocket money. So that means you've got to go and fess up to an adult and ask them to give you the cash. If you're in an abusive relationship, 30 quid can be very hard to explain going missing from the joint bank account your husband has access to.
Yeah.
And for any of us, getting a GP appointment to get it free on the NHS is A, impossible. The drug loses efficacy really quickly. The sooner you can take it after the moment it's happened, the more likely it is to work. They tell you it can be taken up to 3 to 5 days after, but you can still get pregnant if you don't take it really within 24 hours. And we shouldn't be clogging up, GP appointments for something that a pharmacist is very well qualified to dispense. So allowing women to access it freely, quickly, and extremely locally is genuinely bloody good news. And anyone who doesn't agree is just a vile misogynist in my book. Now, of course, they do not protect you from STIs. Of course, we should have access to free contraception. Of course, it should never be something to habitually rely on. But in an age of global backsliding on reproductive and women's rights, I am thrilled that the government is ending this postcode lottery and rolling it out across England, bringing England into line with Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, where for a long time most pharmacies have offered.
Northern Ireland?
Indeed, in Northern Ireland have offered it for free. So we will drop a link in the show notes. This is a really great one to grin and share.
And actually, it's an important one to share because the more eyeballs get on it, the more people will be aware that it's happening.
Exactly.
I still think if you gave most women, if you did a poll, and gave most women the choice between that and clothes with pockets, I think pockets would win.
I agree.
But thank you.
You need a pocket to keep your morning after pill in.
Thank you, Naomi.
And with that, we are going to bring our weekly main show to a close. Thank you all ever so much for tuning into this show and all the extra ones we've been pumping out for you over the past week. Do go back and listen to Kenny's interview with Olivier Morel about Marine Le Pen and to the special show on Trump's economic gamble with Vicky Price if you've not done so already. And all that's left for us to say, therefore, is a huge thank you to you, Danny, for making your Quiet Riot debut.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Danny.
I have a feeling you're going to be a regular voice on this show.
I think I'd like that. Can we get you to commit? Naomi, you're wrong. That's not quite the only thing left for us to say. We do also need to do our regular reminder to everyone tuning in at home to subscribe, to leave a review, visit our bookshop where you can buy Danny's excellent book in hardback format. We will add the paperback in the next few weeks. And if you're able, sign up to back us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod.
We'll be back on Sunday, so until then, take care. Remember, we love you lots, and keep on rioting quietly.
Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou, and produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu, and edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet.
10 minutes to go on the studio. Smashed it. Smashedit.com.